Welcome to the Korea Now podcast. I'm your host, Jed Lea-Henry, and on today's show we have Sam Wells. Now, Sam has an incredibly long career working on issues involving Korea and East Asia, and part of this is 40 years working at the Wilson Center. And it's hard to overstate just how important this work that Sam has done at the Wilson Center actually is. For a long time, people intuited ideas about the Korean War. They approached the Korean War in deeply revisionist terms. They imagined what each side must have been thinking. But at the end of the Cold War, the old communist archives of the Soviet Union, of Eastern Europe, and after that of China, gave the most important insight into the Korean War that we've had for a very, very long time. We could see the decision-making of the key actors, what Kim Il-sung, what Stalin, what Mao Zedong were doing, why they chose the paths they did. And importantly, their level of knowledge, their level of involvement, and their level of commitment to war in Korea. And Sam Wells has played a huge part in this research at the Wilson Center, this archival research. And a lot of this comes together in his new book, due to be published in spring or fall next year, 2019, with Columbia University Press, and entitled The Worst Case, How the Korean War Drove Escalation of the Cold War. Now, I'm going to avoid giving too much of an introduction to this podcast, because this is really a deep history. And for me to try and explain some of the decisions behind the Korean War and the complex calculations that these actors made, I just don't think would do justice to it. The broad outline of the Korean War is something that many of the listeners of this podcast will already know. What Sam Wells adds to this really fleshes out the story in a way that we haven't had access to before. So the story that we get access to today through Sam will look predominantly at Stalin, Mao, and Kim, the important international objectives of each country, of each leader, the domestic concerns that drove this decision-making. And importantly, and this plays out a lot through what Sam is going to tell us here, is the detailed interactions between all three. The conversations they were having, the arguments, the agreements, the backstabbing, the double play, all of which culminates in the decision by all three to go to war in Korea. And below this podcast, I'm going to leave a link to the Wilson Center's archival research. It is rare that you get open access to such new and deeply researched historical content. Now, as always, this podcast is entirely funded by you, the listener. And if you want it to continue, please consider donating at the Patreon account attached below, www.patreon.com/Jed Lea-Henry. On that, and without any further delay, this is Sam Wells. Sam Wells, welcome to the Korea Now podcast.
Thank you.
So we're going to be talking through the origins and the decisions behind the Korean War, particularly Kim, Stalin, and Mao. But what many people may not be aware of, but it's vitally important to this research, is what's happened, I suppose, since the end of the Cold War, which is the opening up of these old communist archives. And a lot of the research that you and some of your colleagues have been doing on this area. So I might get just as a first point here, just to give us a guidance on where we're going with this research. What are these old communist archives, and why is their opening up so important for us?
Well, it's important because for decades we based our knowledge of the Korean War on primarily U.S. archives, supplemented by British archives, and to an extent some French. There were obviously newspaper records that could be checked, and there were congressional hearings and so forth, but it was mainly U.S. records that drove the narrative. And with the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, things were reasonably chaotic in Moscow. And the government of the day decided that one of the things they wanted to do, being urged on by the U.S. and other Western countries, was to be a more transparent government than the communist government had been. And for them, this included opening the archives selectively. They did not open completely the presidential archive in Moscow, but they did open the Central Committee archives, they opened the Foreign Ministry archives, and a few sets of private papers were included. And the Wilson Center, where I've been engaged for over 40 years as a fellow first and then a staff member, set up a project on the Cold War and sought to explore and, if possible, utilize the archives in Moscow. And we were successful in doing that and got a lot of material. Other countries went in. The group of Finnish scholars were particularly diligent and actually lived in Moscow for quite a long time. Got a lot of records. Other countries, the Germans are always very interested in Russia, and they got things. And the center has been able over the years to collect copies of the records that have been gotten from other countries. We also were successful in sending graduate students through Eastern Europe and copying records from the archives of the East European communist allies of the Soviet Union. So we had quite a trove of things which have been translated and are in digitized form on the website of the Wilson Center under the Cold War International History Project. Now, that's the Russian archives as the opening wedge, but using what the Russians had and what the United States and Western countries had, we then wrote some narratives about Chinese, Russian, U.S. interactions and had representatives take these to Beijing and tell the Chinese that we really would like to do a joint project with them in which they would open their archives and be able to tell their own story from their records. It turned out that we had some fairly good leverage at this point because we had been given an opportunity to copy anything we wanted out of the archives of the closest ally in the Warsaw Pact of the People's Republic of China. And this archive gave us access to a lot of Chinese material. So we said, we've got part of your story, but we're sure there's a lot more, and you would probably like to fill in those gaps and tell it in your own words. And they didn't respond immediately. In fact, it took them a number of months to respond. And they finally came back and said, yes, we will do a joint project on the 1954 Geneva Convention. And we did it, and they were very pleased with it. In fact, we let them know we were going to publish a book from it and when the book would be presented for its first discussion. They asked us to postpone the presentation so the foreign minister could be there and take part in it. He was going to be in Washington at about that time, and so we postponed for a week or so, and the foreign minister came, and then we worked out an agreement for subsequent study. So the Chinese archives began to open. Chinese scholars went in, overseas Chinese went in large numbers, and quite a number of Chinese records have come into the Wilson Center Digital Archive. Now, unfortunately, the bad news is that under present governments, both the Russian and the Chinese archives have recently been closed, so that what we've got in our digital archive and what remains to be translated, there's still a few things, is what we'll have for the time being. And that's unfortunate from a historian's point of view, but with nationalism rampant around the world and authoritarianism certainly dominant in Moscow and Beijing, they're not letting anyone, including their own scholars, have free access to their archives. So this project that I've been working on for a number of years takes advantage to the fullest extent possible of records that we have on the Western response to the Korean War, the policies of the Soviets and the Chinese, and to a very good extent, the North Koreans, because we got access to much of the correspondence between Pyongyang and Beijing and Moscow. And that's included in our digital archive collection.
So that's a good foundation here. And you mentioned a lot there, China and Russia, and I suppose we should start about China and the Soviet Union. So let's begin there. Let's begin this narrative, this new way of looking at how the decisions behind the Korean War started. So I suppose it's important to begin this with Stalin, and this is after the Second World War. So let's put it in that frame here. This is Stalin. He's reeling from destruction after the Second World War. There's a lot of internal purges. His country is still heavily in need of aid, and it's struggling. And across the other side of this, he turns his gaze slowly towards Asia and towards Mao. So it might get you to start with Stalin and that period, and then take us forward to this fascinating meeting between Mao and Stalin in December 1949.
Well, Stalin had long had a strategy that placed predominant emphasis on relations in Europe and protecting the Soviet Union from any new attack from the West. So control of Eastern Europe was his first objective, and he had that fairly well in hand by 1949. But he had proved unable to achieve some of his objectives there. He had not been able to prevent the creation of a West German state, which unified the three occupation zones of the Western Allies from World War II. He had not been able to prevent the creation of NATO. He was having difficulty dealing with the possibility of a rearmed Germany, or a Germany involved in what had just been proposed in Paris, a European coal and steel community. So things were not going particularly well with his policy toward keeping Western Europe divided and fairly weak. I should add that when the Marshall Plan to assist the revival of the economies of Western Europe and other countries, if they wished to participate, was announced in 1947, the Soviets and East European countries were invited to the conference that proposed what the United States would offer and what they would require of recipient countries. Well, during the first part of that conference, the Soviets decided that they could not participate, and the East European countries, which wanted to, could not participate, because we were going to require opening of economic records and a degree of collaboration that would have removed the kind of secrecy that dominated Soviet public life. So the Marshall Plan was something, when they failed to join it, they tried to disrupt it, and they were unsuccessful in doing that. So that's another venture in Western Europe that had not succeeded. Now, in the meantime, in the East, the Soviets had withdrawn their occupation forces from the half of Korea that they had occupied in 1945, and they had established the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, which we refer to and will continue to in this discussion as North Korea. And the leader of that country, Kim Il-sung, had, starting in 1949, made numerous requests of Stalin to give him the weapons and the economic assistance and the approval to invade the South and unify Korea. And Stalin had always said, you're not ready, you have a lot of work to do at home, the military situation isn't right, you must wait. And Kim wasn't necessarily pleased about that, but he was in his mid-30s and couldn't really tell the 70-year-old Stalin what he was going to do without approval and very, very heavy assistance. So that's where things stood at the end of 1949. The counts of the number of requests made by Kim to get Moscow support vary, but they're in the dozens. And it was a request that, frankly, Stalin and those of his immediate hierarchy were tired of hearing. And all of this got changed in part because of the nature of the negotiations which the Chinese insisted on having when Mao Zedong came on his first trip outside the country to Moscow in mid-December 1949.
So there you go. That's a good little background there. So let's take us forward here to China, and there's a lot to go into, and we'll come back to some of those issues about Kim Il-sung and Stalin and those requests for invasion, because they're quite an important part of this as well. But let's go forward to China and just introduce Mao a little bit here. So 1949, Mao and the communists have won this civil war against the Kuomintang, the Chinese nationalists, and they pushed them off to Taiwan. And of course, Stalin is across the world considered the leader of this communist bloc. But Mao comes to power without the sort of debt being owed to Stalin that many other leaders that arise do. And when he comes to power, he's not given the same respect that many leaders are given by Stalin. Stalin, from my account, didn't really like him. He was glad that there was a Chinese Communist Revolution and success, but not happy that Mao was in charge of it. And this plays out quite dramatically when Mao makes his first trip up to Moscow. So let's take us up to that December trip to Moscow and Mao and Stalin and that first interaction and why that trip was made and why the tension was there.
Well, it's not only the fact, as you correctly state, that Stalin didn't particularly like Mao and didn't like the way he had run his military campaign against the nationalist government. But Stalin had, as a result of commitments made at Yalta in 1945, established a close and mutually useful relationship with the nationalist government in China. Stalin could make deals with non-communist governments quite easily if he got something very valuable in return. And what he had gotten was control over, as a result of recognizing the nationalists as the government of China and supporting them, he had gotten control of several key ports. He had control over a railroad running from one of those ports into Siberia, and he had a significant economic zone which he could use for trade and access to these warm water ports and so forth. So all of this, and he had a privileged relationship in Outer Mongolia, which was part of his need to protect Central Asia and the parts of Siberia in the west that bordered on Outer Mongolia, which could have been a menace to him with its Muslim populations and so forth. So he had, during the Chinese Civil War, Stalin he gave a modest amount of support to the communists just so he could keep some representatives there to make sure he knew what they were doing. But his main support went to the nationalists who, having very corrupt generals and senior politicians, pocketed much of it themselves and didn't make very good use of it in their military effort or in any way support their own people with it. So Stalin essentially had backed the losing side in that civil war. The momentum and the ambition was with Mao, and he gradually won the Civil War. He had only completed that in at the late summer of 1949 and declared the creation of the People's Republic of China, with the communists obviously in control, on October 1st, 1949. So for him to be going to Moscow right away in December was rather early, but he was desperate for economic aid and for international support. He wasn't getting much of that from Western countries, and he wasn't at this point even in control of all of his own territory. The western part of China was still ruled by people who had been loosely affiliated with the nationalists, but were basically warlords running their own provinces and territories on their own. And it would take almost another 2 years before Mao and his military and security forces got control of the rest of the country. But Mao was an extremely ambitious and impatient leader, and he wanted to push the agenda. So he told Stalin he was coming to have talks about a treaty of alliance. And he took a long train trip to Moscow, arriving in mid-December. And your comment that he was not well received is correct. He was not given the kind of welcome that even the major East European leaders got when they came to Moscow. Stalin initially did not want to talk about a treaty of alliance. He wanted the relationship to remain the same. He wanted to keep all of the concessions that he had won from Jiang Jiechi, the nationalist leader, and he was not at all supportive of the kind of things that Mao wanted. So Mao actually went into a sustained sulk and stayed in his quarters for a number of days, claiming that he was not feeling well. But in fact, from his correspondence back with Zhou Enlai and Beijing, we know he was totally frustrated and angry. So finally, Stalin sent Molotov and one of his other vice premiers to meet with Mao and say he was willing to talk about a treaty. And they started some negotiations. And basically, the kind of treaty that they proposed was one which kept all of the concessions for the Soviets and offered economic assistance as loans to the Chinese, loans which would be repaid probably with extractive products, coal, minerals, what have you. So this was not at all acceptable to Mao, and he made that very clear and rejected the Stalin treaty. And in the meantime, when he had heard that, gotten the message that Stalin would talk about a treaty, he had only at this point invited Zhou Enlai, who was his top diplomat and the person who knew how to work out the fine technical details, who had a staff, some of whom had been trained in the West and had understood quite a bit about how the Soviet Union conducted its legalistic business. Zhou and a substantial delegation came from Beijing and sat in on one of the sessions with the Soviet negotiators and were very upset, as Mao was, over what they were hearing. So they withdrew for several days and worked day and night. And Zhou Enlai constructed a different set of treaties. And they came back and presented these to the Soviets, who were taken aback at the effrontery of this country that was desperate for assistance saying that it wanted a lot of concessions made to it. And the Stalin, there's one document that came from the archives, a copy of the Chinese draft that Stalin had in his possession. Stalin, as is well known, worked late into the night and frequently slept until 10 in the morning or noon. But he had one night gone through this treaty set of documents and marked out most of the concessions with a large blue pencil and written some very negative curses, I'm told, in Russian, in the margin. And you can only imagine what they would have been. And it was his turn to be in a total fit at this point. So after about a day and a half, he made a change, and he decided they would accept many of the Chinese requests, and he ordered the staff at the foreign ministry to write a new set of treaties that incorporated this in the format that they wanted. Now, the big question becomes, why did he reverse his policy? What thought process was behind such a dramatic alteration of his whole approach to Asia?
Yes, that was my very next question, actually. Great. Let's move on to that.
The people have really puzzled over this, and there's been a lot of work done on it. And there are a number of aspects, a number of elements that go into this reversal, we think. The first was the international situation had improved in two key regards. The Soviet Union had had the previous August a successful test of its first atomic bomb. And this gave Stalin the reassurance that he was not subject to the kind of nuclear blackmail that Truman and his first Secretary of State, James Burns, had tried to use in the immediate aftermath of the Yalta Conference. The second thing that was an improvement was that the United States had withdrawn its combat troops from South Korea. And in January of 1950, the Secretary of State and the President had each discussed a new U.S. strategy of reduced commitments in Asia, in which the focus was going to be on the island chain, on Taiwan and protecting it, and on reviving Japan. Japan was to be the anchor for U.S. strategy in the Pacific. In the process, this new strategy and the statements publicly made about it excluded South Korea from the U.S. defense perimeter. Now, the United States never said we won't defend South Korea if attacked, but it did say we don't consider it to be of high strategic value and it is not within our defense perimeter. So that was a comforting notion if the North Koreans were planning to invade. The second issue was that the Chinese made an unexpected concession by giving Moscow primary influence over Outer Mongolia, which is something that had been in the original concessions by the nationalists, but was considered to be a considerable concession. And the other thing is that Stalin thought about what had just happened in Yugoslavia, where Tito had pulled the Yugoslavia out of an alliance with the Soviet Union and had gone a sort of a third way. And Stalin wanted to make sure that he could tie the huge population of China to the Soviet Union and avoid another defection from the communist movement. The most important single thing, however, is Stalin came up with a new concept for Korean policy. And he thought, well, if I support Kim Il-sung and he is successful in unifying Korea, I'll have the warm water ports that I'm eventually giving back to the Chinese. I'll have a dependent ally in control of the whole peninsula, and I'll have a bulwark against revival of the Japanese, who had, after all, dominated Korea and Manchuria for quite a long time. So, on balance, if you insist on a short answer to why did Stalin change his strategy, it's because he would strengthen his overall position in Asia with very little risk. So, with this in mind, he, on January 30th, 1950, sent a cable to Kim saying he should come to Moscow, and he was now ready to help him with the invasion.
Okay, so that's a good point here. Maybe we should move on to Kim. So Kim now enters this picture here. Now, Kim Il-sung, for people, I'm sure people listening know, is the first leader of North Korea, or DPRK, as we now know it. And he comes to power on the back of Soviet help. So he fought under the Red Army, or at least a foreign detachment of the Red Army during World War II. And he sits out most of the war in Russia itself. And when he arrives back in North Korea after the war is over, after Korea is liberated, he arrives in the army uniform, which is the Red Army uniform. So he has this original link already there. And as you mentioned, he immediately begins petitioning for reunification because, of course, this is now a divided peninsula. So let's now take us forward to Kim Il-sung and this very, very young leader, and what he does and why he's petitioning Stalin so much for this, and how he enters the story here.
Well, we're dealing with these three communist leaders, of people of different longevity in their positions, but people of equal ego and ambition. It turns out that Stalin, even though his country had been heavily damaged during the war, still had more resources than the Chinese and new governments in North Korea. Kim, when he arrived after the Soviet forces had come in, he was not at all in the first echelon. He came in late in September of 45, wearing a Red Army captain's uniform. At that point, he was 33 years old, quite a young and not particularly well-traveled or educated person, although he'd spent a lot of time in China, in Manchuria, and in Siberia. He was a leader of a group of about 60 partisans who had fought with him against the Japanese. When he comes into Pyongyang, he had been born in a small town, it's not even a city, outside Pyongyang, had never been to the city. He left as a teenager. I actually went to school in Manchuria at an earlier age. And he knew no one in his new city. He had no political organization. And while he was fluent in Chinese and had workable Russian, his Korean was really quite poor. And he had to work on Korean a lot in order to make the first speech he did as a politician. And the remarkable thing is that this young buck, by February 1946, was named head of the North Korean Provisional People's Committee for the city of Pyongyang, which was the principal city in the new country. He owed this, of course, to his selection by the Soviet political commissar, a man named Terentий Staikov, who was a longtime Asia specialist for the Communist Party. Staikov saw in him a person who had leadership ability, unquestioned ambition, an outgoing personality, and was malleable to Soviet instruction. with this guidance and support, and sometimes strong arm assistance from some of the staff of the Soviets, Kim advanced in the Communist Party and in the military, and he went on to become head of the overall North Korean People's Committee, which was the forerunner of any formal government there, by February of 48. And when the Soviets later in 48 were planning to pull their occupation forces out and the DPRK was being founded, Kim was named prime minister. So he's made quite a leap in the little over 2.5 years that he's been back in North Korea. He was fairly much in control of the government because he had worked from the very start to put his supporters in the police departments in every city and town. He still, however, faced serious rivals for control of the Communist Party. And during the next 1.5 years, he worked with the former political commissar, who was now the Soviet ambassador, Stalin, and his top political advisor, who was named Colonel Alexander Ignatieff. With the guidance of these two fairly shrewd and ruthless characters, Kim maneuvered and coerced a merger of the separate communist parties of North and South Korea. This led many of the South Korean communists to move to the north. They formed a faction that would rival him for control of the party for a while, but by the spring of 1950, he had pushed them aside, or pushed their leaders aside, co-opted them or isolated them. And by the spring of 50, Kim Il-sung was the top official in both the government and the party. So it's at that point, so happens that Stalin has just said he would help him with the invasion. Now he's got control of the party and the government apparatus. So he's ready to move, and he wants to move boldly and quickly.
So that's so Kim travels to Moscow in March 1950, and he again travels then to Beijing in May 1950, because of course this is all leading up. This is just months before the Korea kicks off. So I suppose, why did Stalin reject his requests again and again and again? Because of course this has been an animating theme of the North Korean state ever since Kim Il-sung. But you mentioned Stoichkov there, and it's important here because Stoichkov at a certain point gets quite alarmed about Kim Il-sung, and he starts sending cables back to Moscow saying this man is almost dangerous. Not dangerous in a I'm scared, but scared in the sense that he is only talking and only thinking about war and reunification. So why did Stalin reject his request so many times? And when he eventually agreed, as you mentioned there, he then goes to see Mao. So let's take us from Stalin's visit to then Mao's visit. And why did he have to go and visit both leaders in this regard?
Well, it turns out that he had connections with the Chinese communists, because before he had worked with the Soviet armies in the war against the Japanese. The Soviets were neutral, of course, up until the end of the war with Germany. And after the peace treaty with Germany, the Soviets declared war on Japan. And prior to that, Kim had worked with his group of guerrillas with a Chinese unit, and he had become fluent in Chinese. He felt some debts to the Chinese. The Soviets were the ones who took him over later on and put him into power in North Korea, but he still had his Chinese contacts. So in the latter stages of the Chinese Civil War, Kim had sent significant numbers, really up to and over 100,000 troops to fight with the communists in China. So he had contacts, he had experience, and so forth, and this was obviously known to Stikov and Ignatieff. Stalin, under Stikov's advice, felt that Kim, in the earlier days of 49, early 50, wasn't ready militarily. He wasn't in a sound enough political position, and he didn't have the weapons, and Stalin wasn't prepared to provide the weapons and turn him loose because he sort of doubted his maturity, frankly. And what Stalin had done, which was part of his new concept for Korea, and it's a typical kind of Stalin maneuver to set rivals, set his allies into a form of rivalry. But he, as we saw in negotiations with Mao, had agreed to the Mao Treaty. Then in his March negotiations with Kim, he said, "We will support you. We will provide you with all manner of weapons, ammunition, supplies, tanks, airplanes, so forth. But a condition of this assistance is that you have to get Mao's approval of the invasion and your plan for it, and his commitment to support North Korea if difficulties arise." Now, this is a fairly clever bargaining maneuver because it's like taking out a reinsurance policy that, I'm going to back you on this. I understand it's a low risk proposition, but I'm going to reinsure that risk by making Mao sign on for it. And so when Kim agreed to this, he didn't think there'd be anything of it. He was completely confident that he would, with Soviet support, roll right over the South Koreans, no problem. When he goes to Mao in May, Mao says, "Well, what are you planning?" And he gives him a very sort of general idea of his invasion. Doesn't tell him about the Soviet weapon supplies that are pouring in at that point. In fact, he was so intent on keeping the Chinese somewhat in the dark about his plans that none of the weapons came to him overland, so that the Chinese would have known they were passing through Chinese territory for a time. They came by sea. And the whole buildup was that the Chinese had no military attaches, no connections in North Korea to know what plans were being made for the attack. They had an economic attaché there, but he was on vacation when the attack was launched, and Mao hadn't been told about it. So, I mean, that's the extent to which each of these communist leaders was essentially playing games and manipulating the others. At one point, I referred to them as three scorpions in a bottle. And they're not people that, frankly, as we like to say, we'd want to buy a used car from. But Mao, what's interesting about the Mao meeting to me is that given the limited information that Kim shared with him, and the fact that he asked Mao for his approval, but did not, as he had been instructed, ask for his assistance. Mao thought about this, and he did have Zhou Enlai wake up the Soviet ambassador and asked him to send a cable to Stalin saying, "What did you agree with this kid?" And Stalin came back with a very sort of nebulous response. We agreed that we would support the invasion. That this is a very good idea for communism, and that he needed your full endorsement before this would go ahead. And that was all that Stalin told him. So Mao came back to Kim and said, "Look, I've got this response from Kim, but I'd like to know a little bit more." So what about U.S. intervention? What's going to happen if the U.S. changes its mind and intervenes? Kim said, "That's very unlikely. We're going to have a very quick victory. We're counting on a revolt of some 200,000 people that we have cultivated in South Korea. We're communists waiting for our invasion. And we expect the war to be over in a matter of a few days." And,
so that's sorry, continue.
Yeah, no, it was a very bold and almost out of the air kind of projection. The strange thing is Mao did not press for more detail, but he did say that if America entered the war and crossed the 38th parallel, which is a critical sort of foresight on his part, he said that China would intervene with 3 armies. Kim thanked him, but said this would really not be necessary. So that's where it stood when Kim returned. Mao had essentially fulfilled Stalin's request without paying very much attention to it. And I describe it as a double gamble. Mao was gambling that the United States would not intervene and that China would not have to honor its blank check to assist North Korea. And obviously he lost on both of those.
So that's an important, I suppose, counter-narrative to how many people, at least before these archives opened up, saw the Korean War. There was often this idea out there that Mao was forced into the war. He hadn't agreed to it beforehand. It was just the Americans being too aggressive and pushing too far up. And there was this narrative out there that this wasn't Stalin's war. This was just a Korean war, and America intervened. So it's really important there that we see how Stalin at the background is all for the war and supporting, and so is Mao in many ways prior to the invasion and the pre-planning here. But there's one important element there that keeps running up here, and this is what Mao gets out of this. This is important to touch on, I suppose, because Mao doesn't just see this as an invasion to help out a neighbor, but Mao sees this as something positive for himself. So this is a strange period for Mao and for China. They've just come out of an incredibly long civil war, and as you mentioned, they haven't quite conquered the country yet. But Mao, for at least my understanding, wants to be involved in this war in Korea quite suddenly, and it comes way too soon for them in many ways. And he has to convince members of his own Politburo, in fact, who are quite negative on the idea. But Mao sees this as important because he sees it as a step towards being a communist leader. And as a global communist leader, at some point he is going to have a grand confrontation with the great capitalist, which is America. And he makes a decision, at least from my understanding here, that better to have that war now and better to have it in Korea than in China.
Well, that's correct. And there's some interesting detail to flesh it out. Mao's thinking, it turns out, when the war first, when the invasion occurred and the war broke out, Mao was surprised and irritated because his friend and supposed ally had not told him about it. At one point, when Mao sensed there was a buildup going on, even though he was getting virtually no information from the North Koreans, he asked to send several attachés into North Korea, and Kim refused permission for him to enter the country. And so his initial reaction was to be highly irritated. But he thought, well, okay, the war's coming along, and then bang, within 24 hours, the United States has surprised everybody and announced that it would intervene, and it was sending air and naval forces to evacuate our people, and then it was authorizing our air and naval forces to attack North Korean forces south of the 38th parallel, et cetera. So at that point, Mao's thinking, well, I'm probably going to have to enter this war, but the North Koreans, if they're right, are going to roll it up pretty quickly, and we'll just come in at the end and help close it out. Some very interesting research has come out recently by Professor Xin Zhihua of Shanghai and Beijing, who's probably the top expert on Chinese and North Korean relations with Stalin. He really has mined completely the available archives in Moscow, and he's gotten into, before they were closed, a lot of the Chinese records. He talked in a recent book that he's got called A Misunderstood Friendship, Relations Between Mao Zedong, Kim Il-sung, and the Sino-North Korean relationship, 49 to 76. He made a presentation on this at our center the last 2 weeks, and he talked about the paternalistic attitude that Mao had adopted from the classical Chinese writings about the duties of the former Chinese emperors over states that they had earlier controlled, like Manchuria, or areas they controlled, like Manchuria and Korea. And he felt when the North Koreans did get into trouble, he felt there was going to be a need to intervene more quickly than he had initially thought. Now, one of the key new discoveries is that by the middle of July 1950, this is within 2.5, 3 weeks of the outbreak of the war, Mao has decided that China will have to intervene, that it will have to be sooner rather than later. He has to begin preparing for it. He has Zhou Enlai call the military commission together and study the defensive needs, and orders an army of 300,000 of their best troops sent to Manchuria to be prepared in case they need to intervene quickly. Now, he knows he has to persuade a lot of his former generals and marshals from the Civil War, who are members of the Politburo, to go along with this, but he starts working on them, and that's a process of persuasion that goes into early October. But by September, before MacArthur does his invasion at Incheon, his amphibious envelopment there, the Chinese already have 600 to 650,000 troops in Manchuria. Mao and Zhou Enlai are convinced they will need to intervene when they had, by the way, done an assessment of MacArthur as a military leader and of U.S. strategy in Korea, and had, on the basis of a general staff study, predicted that the Americans would do an amphibious operation, because MacArthur was known for liking these envelopments to hit the enemy in the rear. And they had predicted Incheon. And they had informed Kim twice that he should defend Incheon because this was a likely point of an American invasion. And Kim didn't pay any attention to them. There were no additional defenses put up in Incheon. There were extra mines there. They didn't mine the access routes in. They didn't have any additional troops there. And the troops who were there when the bombardment started largely fled. So Kim Kim is very deficient in his preparations here, but the Chinese were on top of the prospects, had predicted this, and when Incheon occurred, they said, we're likely to have to intervene sooner. So Mao launches a real campaign of persuasion with his Politburo. And this goes all the way up until the first week in October, when there are a series of essentially all-night sessions, him arguing, and he eventually calls in the man that he will tentatively choose and does ultimately choose as the commander of the forces, Chinese forces in Korea, Peng Dewa, who was in charge of this 650,000 in Manchuria, calls him back to Beijing to participate in this Politburo meeting, even though he's not a member. And Peng endorses, after Mao had a private one-on-one with him early in the morning before the final meeting, Peng endorses Mao's strategy. The need to intervene is now. So then the Politburo decides to go with a couple of dissenters still there, but Mao has well over 2/3 of the support, some of it a bit reluctant, but they're ready to go. And then they're delayed somewhat, counting on getting a lot of weapons and ammunition supplies from the Soviets, who had part of the deal would be if the Chinese did have to intervene, well, the Soviets would give them a lot of support because they didn't have adequate weaponry to stand up to the Americans. And the Soviets delayed on that, which became a very sore point with the Chinese and was talked about for years. And you can still hear it raised in discussions between Chinese and Russians.
And of course, that's one of the reasons when people read about the Korean War, this idea that the Chinese used to attack the American soldiers and then retreat up into the hills. It was a attempt in the Soviets to come in and help them with air power there. But
exactly.
We're talking about America entering the war here. So this is an important question, and it's come up a few times, but I suppose it needs asking here. How much of this how much of the idea that America not entering the war, how much of that planning came from Soviet spy intelligence? Because a lot of people may know the very famous British double agent Kim Philby, but a lot of the understanding that at least I can gather that Stalin got about the Korean War, from what we now know, came from this understanding there that they were getting double information, and one of that was a deep reluctance in Washington to get involved. And you mentioned a couple of times there that all three actors in this, maybe Stalin most reticent of all, but all the other two were very, very confident that America would not intervene in a conflict in Korea.
Well, everything that one could have known about the Truman administration's posture in mid-June 1950 indicated that there would not be any undertaking of military action in an area that was not considered vital strategically for a government, the Syngman Rhee government in South Korea, that they viewed as corrupt and impossible to deal with, really. And they really wanted to have as little to do with him as possible. And Truman had set, as is well known, a limit on the defense budget. This was in parallel with reducing the range of commitments in Asia. He wanted a ceiling of $15 billion, and in the bill provided by the Congress in early 1950 for the defense expenditures, he refused to spend $800 million of that because he wanted to save the money and try and tamp down inflation. So he was very reluctant to do anything, and he just changed his mind. And everybody else, when there was a violation of the United States placed very high importance on the fact that a government crossed an internationally recognized boundary and invaded another country. Now, never mind that, as many revisionists said during the 80s and 90s, revisionist historians, that there was a civil war in Korea from 1948 on, with raids and so forth, back and forth, which there was, and that there was no reason for the United States to get involved in it. But the administration took the legal problem of the North Koreans crossing an international border and invading another country very seriously. And in the first meeting he had with his cabinet when he came back to Washington on the morning that the information had just been announced in the United States of the invasion, everybody was agreed that this was an action initiated by the Soviets and was a probe of the will of the administration to resist this kind of provocation, and that resistance was necessary, and the best way to do it was to try and get an endorsement of the resistance by the United States as a United Nations mandate. And by the 27th of June, they were fortunate to do that because the Soviets were boycotting the Security Council.
So how much in all of this? So I've been hearing this a few times here. This is a fascinating thought here. There was an understanding a lot through all of this that Stalin was he was decrepit and he was ill and he was out of touch and he was failing. But through all of this, he seems to be the one that benefited the most. And as the Korean War does drag on, some of the information from those archives have shown that Stalin wanted to drag the war out, that it was absolutely beneficial for him. So it was beneficial for him to get involved, as from what he could claim in Korea, and it was beneficial for the war to continue. So there seems to be a contradiction here. There's understanding that we have of Stalin as this person out of touch and ill and failing to be in touch with his own inner circle, let alone the world outside it. But he also comes across as a master manipulator here in the way that he seems to manipulate Mao into the conflict, and he gains access to everything he wanted anyway, despite bringing this war forward and playing this not fantastic game, but very interesting, subtle game of conflict. And he seems to have been the great, out of all of them, he seems to be one that won the most from this.
Well, he certainly handled if he wanted to improve his position in Asia with minimal risk and have the warm water ports and so forth, why, it all looked very good up to the point where MacArthur invaded at Incheon. But from there on, things began not to look so good because there was a big drain on Soviet resources to support the North Koreans and the Chinese. And at the same time, the United States, which took this as a major challenge, and took them a few weeks to realize how serious an invasion the Chinese had made. But once they did, they revised a new strategy and they implemented fully the programs that had been proposed by a National Security Council report called NSC 68, which called for a major nuclear and conventional buildup to respond to an increasing Soviet threat. And this document had just been circulated in the government and was under debate because Truman didn't want to really pay for these kinds of programs that would cost a lot of additional defense spending. when the North Koreans invaded. So essentially the North Korean invasion and the Chinese intervention in particular led to the full implementation of the recommendations of NSC 68 and a massive buildup of conventional and nuclear forces, the militarization of NATO, et cetera. So in response to that, Stalin had to accelerate greatly his efforts, which were already underway, to develop a long-range bomber and nuclear weapons of his own so that he would not be outclassed in the sort of nuclear threat kind of competition. So basically, the book that I have written devotes about half of its space to the key decision making and the way the war unfolded, which we've talked about, and another half to the buildup and what is the escalation of the Cold War, so that you come out with essentially a full nuclear arms race with American commitment to keep 6 divisions of military forces in Western Europe, a firm peace treaty and alliance relationship with Japan and so forth. So, and American troops remaining in South Korea to this day. So, I mean, all that starts as a result of the way the Korean War unfolded, and the magnitude of it is certainly triggered by the Chinese intervention, which was thought to be Stalin putting in many additional assets, raising the stakes in the whole game, and the assumption being in Washington that if the Chinese were about to be defeated, and there was a possibility that they could have been if the United States had really gone after it, that the Soviets would come into the war themselves. So as in the conclusion of the strategic review that starts in November and is resolved by early December of 1950, there is a real possibility that this whole thing can slide into World War III. So it's that kind of mentality that's behind this massive buildup, and why I title my book The Worst Case, because it was worst case logic that led the Americans to assume they had to do this maximum effort. And looking at the Soviet records and what they spent on nuclear and bomber development, it's difficult not to find the decisions by the Truman administration, by and large, justified.
So I might finish this off here with a couple of questions, because it's such a fascinating opportunity to pick your minds and you have access to those archives. So one of the things that comes up a lot in Korean studies and is this UN vote, because of course this is not a war between America and North Korea and invading troops, but it's the first UN war. This is a UN resolution that gets passed, and there's this of course there's this strange phenomena that when the vote comes forward to the Security Council, the Soviet representative is not there. And this is one of those things that often gets played out, and people talk about this as strategic. He was deliberately not there because Stalin wanted war, and in some ways he wanted to increase mainland China's chance of securing that seat from Taiwan. So how do you see this UN vote and the absence of the Soviet representative?
Well, there's every indication that the American intervention surprised the Soviets more than it did the Chinese. And I think it's possibly also the case, although I've not seen documentary evidence on it, that the Soviets never thought that if the U.S. did happen to intervene in this circumstance, that they would try and make it a UN operation. Mainly, the documentation that's been available shows that the Soviet ambassador was not present because he was boycotting the fact that the Security Council and the General Assembly had refused to seat the People's Republic of China as the holder of the Security Council permanent seat that had been held by the nationalist government. So it was essentially a communist brotherly support to try and get that seat, and feeling that the stakes really weren't that high. Now, the ambassador didn't stay away for very long. He's back there in a few days and being obstructive while he is. And he even, during the rotation, comes up as chair of the Security Council, I think, in October. So they're fully back in at that point. But the UN commitment has been made, the resolutions have been passed, and the resolutions were drafted in the U.S. State Department, and they're fairly open-ended. They call on the members of the mandate is to call on all members to assist in repelling the invasion and restoring peace in the region. Now, restoring peace in the region, MacArthur took as cleaning out all the North Korean armed forces and Chinese from North Korea. So there's a lot of wiggle room in that particular formulation.
So next question here, something about Mao. So one of the other things that keeps coming up is this idea that Mao, despite all the scenarios that we've spoken about and all the reasons for Mao being involved in this conflict, one of them was also a domestic concern. That is, he had just come to power. He had just fought this long and protracted civil war inside his own country. And though he had support for his government and his new communist government inside the cities, he didn't have it in the provinces and he didn't have it in the countryside. And this Korean War was an opportunity for Mao in some ways, not just for all the things that we mentioned, but for a way to put those people that he saw as challenges to his authority or outright enemies, to send them across the war, put them on the front line and let them die for the country.
Well, I think there is huge evidence to support that. And there are multiple dimensions. Now, part of it, in the Civil War, when the nationalist forces, starting in late 1948, were getting defeated, and many of the soldiers were mercenaries. They had no ideological commitment and virtually no education, most of them. They were given an iron choice by the communists. Either you join us and fight or we kill you. So the Chinese People's Liberation Army had in it, when they declared the People's Republic, a lot of less than enthusiastic members in support of the regime. These people were put in the front lines after the war got started, and it was sort of a Darwinian test. If they survived, fine. Now, in addition to that, Mao did write quite a lot about a nationalist. The war provided a surge of nationalism to convince many people who had been ambivalent or negative toward his regime that it was worth supporting, if no other reason, because of their personal security, because people who did not support this nationalist call were viewed as opposition to the regime. They were removed from official positions. They were penalized. In many cases, they were rounded up and killed. And they were dealt with nationalist supporters. They're either traitors and bandits, or they become supporters. So, and particularly in places like Xinjiang and the provinces in the Northwest, there was a lot of coercion and suppression that went on. And some of this had happened in the cities as well, because the cities were not totally for Mao. So he used the war to, in a sense, gain additional support for the regime and eliminate many active and potential opponents.
As a final couple of questions here, just two more. What is the role that Japan plays in all of this? Because we haven't mentioned it that very much so far, but it seems to be this sort of specter looming over Asia. So yes, it's been destroyed, it's been conquered by America, it's on its knees, but the memory is still there. And it still does have great capacity as a warfighting nation, even though it's still on its knees, it can rebuild. And how much is there a fear in the minds of not so much Kim, because this is more of a nationalist reunification struggle, but how much is there a fear in the minds of Stalin and Mao that Korea is important, because if we don't hold it, then it can become a land bridge from which Japan can launch another invasion, another war, just like the one that they had witnessed in the past few years.
Well, the American plan for Japan was quite clear. They hoped to democratize, to reindustrialize, and then essentially to leave, having Japan as our principal ally in East Asia. So having a revived Japan as an American ally was a potential threat to certainly China's ambitions. Because among the things that the war provided an opportunity for Mao to do was to become the leader of communism in Asia. And this is a goal that Stalin held out for him and Mao enthusiastically accepted. Now, this is not something that Kim Il-sung took to particularly well, but the Chinese had. It turns out, among the things that we're discovering from the Chinese archives, is that Mao had on two occasions tried to persuade Stalin to have Kim Il-sung removed as leader of North Korea. He did in 1949, he did again in 1955. And he absolutely had him shoved aside during the war. And he kept him informed of the general pattern of what was going on, but he was not involved in either planning or the implementation of the decisions. The Chinese marshal, Peng Dewa, ran the whole thing, thought Kim was a young punk and had no sense of proper military strategy, and said some really extremely critical things about him at that point. So, I mean, the Chinese were taking over and treating the North Koreans like they were, essentially colonists. And so this notion of the Chinese becoming leaders of communism in Asia was not great news to Kim and his colleagues in the government. But in fact, when you look realistically at the overall calculus of, how did the war work out for all three? Well, Kim was restored to his position as the head of North Korea, and he kept that and he strengthened it. Mao emerged much stronger and as a leader of communism, and Stalin paid a fairly high price and came out with none of the things he had hoped to get. And as well as the fact that the Chinese leadership, and Mao in particular, were very suspicious of him, and the seeds of the Sino-Soviet split are right there in this slow and manipulative way that Soviet provided key military assistance to the Chinese when they were really getting mauled by the American heavy weapons. Let me just share one story that Professor Shen mentioned, which I had not heard before, and he was describing to a foreign visitor his lack of respect for Kim Il-sung and the fact that he had twice tried to have him removed. He spoke as Chinese sometimes like to do in parables. He said, Kim is like a small tree planted in North Korea by the Soviets. He was pulled up by the roots by the United States and left for dead. China rescued him and replanted him. Now, 1956, he has grown out of control, is unruly and disobedient. No.
Yes. Yeah, that's a great little insight into the mind there, isn't it?
Yep. So, this is just getting the young man by the back of the neck.
And Sam, you've gone ahead and answered my final question as well. It was going to be about the long-term ramifications and the split and the different decision making there. So, yeah, great. That's been fascinating. Before we finish this, I must get you to introduce your book because, as you mentioned, what we spoke about today, of course, is a very small part of your upcoming book. So I'll get you to introduce that and when people might be able to expect to see it on bookshelves.
Well, it's entitled The Worst Case, How the Korean War Drove Escalation of the Cold War. And it's divided, as I mentioned, into two parts. One, the way in which the war drove key decisions in Moscow, Pyongyang, Beijing, and particularly in Washington. And a second half on the escalation, the whole allocation of well over a majority of the assets of this large military buildup go to Europe. How the Strategic Air Command is expanded by a factor of 4 and becomes the highly operational nuclear strike force that would be the principal deterrent element that the United States will use in facing down the Soviet Union over the Cuban Missile Crisis. You have a significant buildup of the Central Intelligence Agency, which had been quite dysfunctional, and it's reformed and expanded in size and budget, particularly in its covert operations departments, by a factor of 6. Now, on the Soviet side, they're pouring huge resources in an attempt to get a long-range strategic bomber that can threaten the United States. They're more successful in developing their nuclear weapons, and there's a big section on the nuclear weapons program and what both the aircraft designers and the nuclear weaponeers had to go through, since both of them had to conduct their projects in secret under the close and unloving supervision of Beria, the security chief, who had his minions watch every action and whose people in every plant and every lab suspected a failure in a particular test was sabotaged by engineers, designers, and physicists who were in many cases Jewish and cosmopolitan and therefore enemies of the regime, and who by and large were very few members of the Communist Party. So it's an interesting story, but a lot of the institutions in the Soviet Union and the United States that came to shape the remainder of the Cold War have their origins right in this years of the Korean conflict.
So a good point to leave it on there. And of course, I recommend people keep their eyes open for this book. I will myself. And in the meantime, I will also put below this podcast a link to the Wilson Center's archival work on the Korean War, so people can go and have a look at that project themselves.
Well, there are lots of people who use those documents for university papers and theses and all manner of things. But it's really quite an exciting experience to sit down and read the cable exchanges back and forth between Stalin, Mao, and Kim.
Yeah, it feels like such a great clarification on history in many ways. So you had to intuit so much before, and then you can get this wonderful insight. And for people listening, it really is that detailed. You can literally see the conversations between these leaders there. It's a great little resource for any historian out there. But I'll leave it on that. Sam Wells, thanks for coming on the Career Now podcast.
Well, thank you, Jed. It's been very, very pleasant